Please welcome the panel on Escaping Scam City, Untangling the Human and Economic Cost of Cybercrime. Moderated by Manisha Tank, presenter, CNN International.
Take a seat, everyone. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Manisha Tank. I'm going to be moderating this conversation today. I was introduced to the Scam City story by a wonderful woman who's sitting here in the front row, Laura Entwistle. And Laura's NGO puts its voice behind unheard stories, stories that we need to hear about in this region that affect our lives in ways we may not know. Let me get a read of the room. Who has ever experienced a scam call and recognized that it was a scam call? Wow. There we go. We're all on the same page. I could say that's good to see, but actually it isn't good to see, because behind those scam calls is an industry which I think you could use the word abhorrent when you describe it. And as we get into the nitty-gritty in this conversation, you'll understand why I use that word. But I hope by the end of this conversation, you will also feel some hope that people like those on the panel today are working together to make sure that there is more protection out there, that there is more activism out there to do something about these scams. So let's get into it, because you don't want to listen to me the whole time. I think we need to start the story by putting us all on the map. So with that, that is an indication to our production crew to bring up the first graphic, which is a graphic of some territories that you will recognize in this part of the world with some numbers. Jake, over there at the end of the line, is going to describe what's actually going on here and why it's important that we have maps like this.
Thank you. So what you're seeing in this map, if you look at the three red countries in this map, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, the landscapes of those countries, particularly in border areas, but actually across the country and in the Cambodian context as well, has become dotted with a series of hundreds of militarized compounds that are run by transnational crime syndicates, in many cases protected by state actors that have, get ready for it, enslaved tens, potentially hundreds of thousands of people and forced them to conduct scams on a historically unprecedented scale, the volume of which now accounts for potentially, if you take the numbers from the UN or the US government or Chainalysis or some of the major analysts that are out there, seriously, potentially the most significant economic engine in the entire Mekong subregion, and almost certainly the largest industry that has ever existed in the country of Cambodia. And so what we're facing here is a convergence of state, criminal, and technological actors that is basically historically unprecedented and impacting the world at a scale that cyber criminal activity just has not reached up to this point.
In some narratives where drugs are involved, we use the word narco state. Would you say that Cambodia is a scam state?
Cambodia is a scam state.
Okay. Yeah. Who in the room is surprised by the sort of the volume of this, how big this is? Have you heard these numbers before? Like, we're getting a hand at the back there. I think, yeah, exactly. We're getting some acknowledgement that this is way bigger than you could possibly imagine. That was how I felt when I listened to this podcast that Laura has helped with, and Jake, you've been involved with, Escaping Scam City. What was the most surprising aspect of your involvement, of your experience, when you tried to actually witness this happening?
So I actually worked for almost 4 years in Cambodia at the sort of start of this issue, and certainly the profound, egregious involvement of the Cambodian government is one very shocking thing. But the nature, the severity of the cases, of the actual human stories, and then the real human courage that it is taking to combat this on the grassroots level is really inspiring. And I think we come back to this at the end, but there's hope in this as well. When you look at a picture like that, that's Kaibo, which is one of the largest scam compounds in Sihanoukville, Cambodia. Potentially 10,000 people being held at that location. Each one of those people is a real person that has some amount of agency left, and many of those people are fighting for each other or for their own freedom, and then there are entire networks of people, their families, the families and the networks of the people that they're scamming on the other side of the world that are suffering and hoping to see something change in this situation.
So let's talk a little bit more about what the victims look like. We've got victims on the side of those who get scammed into thinking that they have a legitimate job and they end up being enslaved in these compounds. And I hope that you're seeing a picture of the compound. And then on the other side, you have the people who are being scammed and they end up giving up their money. It could be they think that they're in a relationship and, they're sending money to a loved one and it doesn't turn out to be the case. Or they are fooled into thinking that this has got something to do with their own bank account or their own accounts or finances or the government. Shibani, can you speak to your experiences talking to victims and understanding this from both sides of the coin?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Jake set up really, really well, these compounds house, tens and thousands of people who respond to what they think is a legitimate job ad. It might come from a friend of theirs, it might come from a recruiter, it might come from a Facebook post, it might come from Telegram, and they believe that when they meet the recruiter, often in, a legitimate office setting, or they go for an interview somewhere, that they are going to often Thailand, to work an IT job or have like a very normal career there. Often they're coming, but not always, from countries where job opportunities are limited. But sometimes they're just promised what is a pretty lucrative salary in a city like Bangkok, right? Which, it sounds like a pretty good job offer. Once they get there, they find themselves handcuffed, blindfolded, driven across the border to Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and are made essentially to sit in front of a computer, work 12 hours or more to find victims all over the world and to scam them of their money. It's become a much more sophisticated way of scamming people, and it's really psychological, right? They're trained specifically to know what makes people tick and to find people's weaknesses, right? When we've done some investigative work on this, and we've seen actual instructions, right? On okay, so if somebody's had a bad day, this is what you say to them, this is how you make them feel better. If they're opening up to you about this, this is how you respond. And the goal is for them to get into what makes you tick, and then get you to trust them, and then get you to trust them enough to give up your money, right? And it's a real long game for many of these scammers.
Okay, speaking of money, thank you for the segue. David, any estimates on the kind of money that people are being scammed out of? I know that you can certainly speak to Singapore, and then we can just extrapolate out what that might mean for other economies.
So to put things in perspective, Singapore just has 6 million people. But for the last 2 years, we've been accumulating losses due to scams to the order of more than a billion Singapore dollars. That's about 800 million US dollars per year. The first 6 months of this year, it's more than 450 million Sing dollars out of a population of 6 million. This is a huge sum of money. And the people who are facing these losses come from all walks of life. They're not just the what you might imagine, the older, vulnerable population. You have working adults, you have younger people who are just transacting online, etc. So it affects everybody. The types of scams which they are falling for, a whole range: phishing scams, e-commerce scams, investment scams, love scams, and government official impersonation. I think that perhaps is something I could speak a little bit about. Singaporeans, I think, by and large, are trusting and compliant. So when you get a phone call from someone who says that he or she is from the government, you tend to think that, oh yes, all right, fine. And then you follow the instructions, etc. And sadly, a lot of people lose their life savings on this type of scams. So it's I think we've talked about the human cost of the people who've been trafficked, but I think on the victim side of the house, these types of victims who are at the receiving end of the scam calls, they too face a huge personal cost. I think you really find people losing their entire life savings. And the impact is not just on the individual, but on the entire family.
Yeah, and I would imagine that those people want to know, well, is there a way that I can be insured against this? Is there a way that I can get my money back? What would be the answers to those questions?
Right. So if I could speak a little bit on that. Firstly, the challenge of scams is that it's really cross-functional. Singapore is a small country, but I'm happy to say that interdepartmental stovepipes, they're scalable. We have them in Singapore as well, right? So some agencies, the banks will say that it's not their fault, it's the telco issue. It's a law enforcement issue, it's coming from another jurisdiction, etc. So the first challenge is that actually this issue cuts across different stovepipes. And it is difficult for us, any society, to see across all the stovepipes. And the criminals exploit this. And they exploit the differences in the rules, in the risk tolerances, and in the coordination mechanisms. And they exploit this so that on our part, I think it behooves us firstly to be able to coordinate across the different departments. So I'm happy to say that in Singapore, fortunately, we're small enough. So our police force has set up an anti-scam center. And in this anti-scam center, we've managed to bring the police, law enforcement agencies there, the telco companies, the telecommunications authority has brought in the big telcos in Singapore, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the banking regulator, has brought in the major banks in Singapore. So in the same room, you have people from across 3 different industries. When you get a phone call, then you can coordinate quickly, and the bank representative can access the account and say, like, look, what's happening, etc. And they can actually freeze the bank accounts immediately. So when there is a report from a member of the public who says, I think I've been scammed. It's like, what happened? My account is this, from this bank, etc. And they can access this quickly. Now what we're trying to do is bring the tech company, the platform companies as well, because a lot of scams are being perpetrated through advertisements on the messaging apps or on the platforms. So I think they're starting to bring that in. So you find that this is something that is coming across multiple channels, and then people get transferred over, as Shibani said, that the scammers win over their trust and confidence, and then they part their money. 80%, almost 80% of the scams that Singapore Police Force investigate are self-effected scams. It's not that the scammer has taken over your bank account, hacked your phone, or anything like that. It's convinced you that there's a friend on the other side, a lover on the other side, an investment, and the individual actually voluntarily hands over the money. 80%.
That's a demonstration of how pernicious this is. Rafael, let's bring you in, because obviously David there was talking about the technology, what has enabled this. And Shibani, you shared this with me in the speaker's room before. This really ballooned after COVID. This ballooned after people started coming online and developing more relationships online and talking online a lot more than before. What is your role? You're here representing Meta. There are some who would say, well, if all of this is happening, then the tech companies have failed. What would be your response to that?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot. I think the first thing I would say is, we do a lot in collaboration with governments such as the Singaporean government, which we're really proud of, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Singapore Police Force, CSA. We do a lot to collaborate with the banks. We have a data sharing program with them. We've recently set up a signal sharing program with other tech companies like Microsoft and Google. And those are just part of the offline efforts, right? And if I stay just offline for a minute, and then I'll get to the online aspects shortly. One of the things that we've been able to do over the course of the last couple of years is really focus on these scam centers, right? And really share intelligence with law enforcement when we have it about what we're seeing on our platforms, where these scam centers are located, and in some cases even help arrest criminals as they transit jurisdictions where where that happens. So, we've worked very closely with the Royal Thai Police, for example, and, as Jacob was showing, Thailand's right in the middle there. So we do a lot of work with the Royal Thai Police, and so if some of these criminals transit Thailand, sometimes they can make an arrest, right? And I think that, that is kind of what we're seeing right now, especially when it comes to these scam cities, is that we are starting to see this collaboration start to pay dividends, right? There's a lot more attention now on the fact of, as Jacob and Shibani just really put it, like the scale of what is operating, the number of people that are enslaved in forced criminality, and the impunity with which these criminal syndicates are operating. And so, to the extent that we can help with those things, and I think we've helped quite substantially in terms of intelligence sharing, data sharing, we're really proud of that work. I think now if we look at our online efforts, going just back to these criminal scam syndicates, the ones in Southeast Asia, we've put a huge amount of effort into really targeting those just because of again, like how big the problem is in this part of the world out here. And I'm happy to share that over the last, since 2004, we've taken down over 12 million accounts.
12 million?
12 million just from the scam centers in Southeast Asia, mostly, again, in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, right? Just in these scam centers. Again, that just speaks to the scale of what we're looking at here offline. In terms of other online efforts, we've worked really closely with the Ministry of Home Affairs here in Singapore and other governments to make product adjustments and how our products are offered to people. In terms of advertisements, we've started a pilot program in Singapore where we started requiring ID for advertisers on some of our platforms. We've now required that going forward of all advertisers in Singapore. We've run this high-risk model that we piloted in Singapore and now just rolled it out in Thailand and a number of other countries. And so you combine that with a lot of the tools that we've developed when it comes to AI and other heuristics to identify scam behaviors on our accounts. And we are really starting to see, as David, when we were talking ahead of time, we're starting to see some bending of the curve, right? At the Global Anti-Scam Summit that was here in Singapore just last month, our global product personnel that cover scams reported that we were able to see reductions across our platforms of around 65% globally. So we really are starting to see some progress. There's still obviously a long way to go.
Yeah.
But I think that the key part here is the collaboration. It's is really what David said. We all have to be working together, government, civil society, and the platforms, the telecommunications companies and the banks. And I think the next step really is focus on these scam centers. Yeah.
Speaking of which,
if I could just jump in, I just want to build on Rafael's point about the need for collaboration. I think internally, domestically, within a country, the different government agencies need to collaborate, right? Because they have different equities, you have different responsibilities, etc. And then I think it's key to work with industry, because I think the global platforms, the tech platforms have enormous perspective, and I think that there are trade-offs that are being done, and the victims are our citizens. So we need to come together, share that information, that data, so that we can be more effective. Otherwise, the criminals are actually exploiting the differences in our equities to the advantage, and the people who are suffering are our citizens.
Absolutely. I want to bring it to you, Jake, and actually picking up off that point. Sure. Yes, there has to be collaboration. And yet, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've actually been banned from countries because of your work in this space. And actually what you need is collaboration between countries. Why have you been banned? Where have you been banned from?
I won't go into the full list of countries that have been banned from, but I'm not a welcome guest in the countries that play host to this. The red countries on there aren't a huge fan of the work that I'm doing. But absolutely collaboration is needed, but we also need to collaborate with open eyes about the nature of, one, who the principally culpable actors are, two, where the crime is occurring, and three, basically what we're up against. So I'll start there just very briefly. We have been fighting the war on drugs to the effect of drugs being much more widely available today than they were 80 years ago when we started fighting it. And what we're looking at here is the emergence, the nascent early stages of something that is far easier to do. It requires none of the territorial control, very little of the violence that's taken, that's required to enforce drug networks for a variety of reasons. This is a much easier, much more lucrative, more fungible, and for a variety of reasons, more profitable for criminal organizations to undertake. And so as we start looking at these collaborations, that yes, they have to cross industry, they have to cross country, we have to find ways of eliciting effective action from the folks that are not giving that. We also have to have some realism that disruption is probably the name of the game. Like, it is probably not going to be the case that Singaporeans in 5, 10, 15, 80 years from now are not impacted by very sophisticated scams. And so we need to think about ways, if you're thinking about eradication versus blunting the growth curve, these are two different types of responses. So I'll say that. And then secondly, and I sort of alluded to this, as we engage in collaboration, it's very important that we stay clear-headed about the impunity that marks this space. Rafael started to mention this, but again, as state crime convergence goes, we're in the very early stages of understanding what state cybercrime actually looks like. And yes, there are 500 locations that we know exactly where they are. We know who own them. We know exactly what they're doing in those locations, and they are absolutely untouchable. But there are also, not to discount the 16 or 12 million ads that were taken down, there is also a growing proliferation of just about anyone who comes out of these compounds. There's 2 or 3 major tech platforms that all of these people are, at some point, their life cycle is touching. The life cycle of exploitation. That happens both with the upstream victims and the downstream victims. And so as we're developing and working together to develop new solutions, we're up against actors that are very, very well motivated to do this at a high level. They receive a lot of protection, and we're going to have to become very creative about how we respond. So just one quick anecdote. Shibani was raising this earlier, and maybe she can go into more depth about how these people go through legitimate job interview processes, right? They might get called in for an interview in a nice room, like what we were sort of debriefing for. The job ads don't always look that dissimilar from legitimate job ads that are on the same job forums. And so we have to look at more creative ways to go after this. Like, how do we make sure people know ahead of time that this might be an issue? How do we look at ways to use the types of data that we're collecting on our users to actually target the locations that they're working from, and not just the accounts that they're utilizing and repopulating ad infinitum? So, and there's a billion more things I could throw out there, but we're up against a very, very sophisticated, nimble, and well-protected adversary, and so we're going to have to up our game accordingly.
So we have to understand the adversary, how it works. Shibani, let me take it to you. Can you give us a behind-the-scenes picture, because you've done such in-depth research on this, you've talked to victims. What's going on in these scam centers, and where are all these people coming from? Because earlier we were having a conversation in the ready room, and what shocked me was they're coming from all over the world, not just from this region.
Just to piggyback on what Jake said, but also respond to that question. I think what we really need to understand is that these are truly transnational syndicates, right? I mean, in the same way Meta is a giant corporation, these are like massive corporations with little cells everywhere, and people who are part of the food chain, from like Dubai when they're recruiting the Ethiopian person who's coming into the job, to the person who's trafficking them in Thailand, to the person who's receiving them in Cambodia, and sometimes even the person who's rescuing them because they get kickbacks from it as well. So it's like a whole food chain that is very circular, and you have people profiting at every step of the way, right? When I was in Cambodia to actually visit a scam compound last year, I hired a driver, right? Like a random driver, as you would in Cambodia. And essentially he, as he drove around Cambodia, was pointing out all these different scam compounds to me. How he knew was because he has been hired multiple times to drive people in and out of those scam compounds. And like, I just hired him like from a company. Like I wasn't saying like, hey, I want to find somebody who drives people around into scam centers. I was hiring a driver who, because this industry touches everything, himself has been earning money illegally, obviously, off human trafficking, right? And he says, I don't have a choice. Like if if somebody calls me and is like, can you drop this person off to such and such location, you're just going to do it. You're like a driver in Cambodia. But like, then something really bad is happening because they're like handcuffed and they're quiet and your phone goes dead the moment you go into the compound, because some of them have location and GPS blockers and stuff, and you're like, this is odd, but you're just going to do it, right? I mean, when you go to these compounds, you realize there's a whole ecosystem around it, right? There are people who like sell food to the construction workers, who are building the addendums to the compounds because they keep growing and growing. A few years ago when Jake and I had first started speaking about this industry, there was a lot of talk that AI would take over and, you could just use AI to automate everything. You won't need the human, people, right, who are sitting there and like doing these scams. But that really hasn't, jived with what we've been seeing on the ground. I was just speaking to somebody in law enforcement, who said, now sharing this just now too, that AI is really imperfect with some languages, and because of the crackdown, so China has been cracking down in a big way on this industry, and so these criminals know where their bread is buttered, right? I mean, China just sentenced a really powerful family connected these crime syndicates to death in a trial yesterday, a compound that we actually wrote about pretty extensively, but they know where their bread is buttered, so they know now that they don't want to mess with Chinese people, right? And they don't want to traffic Chinese people as much. So they're looking to other countries. Japan and Korea have emerged as major ones. But AI is really bad at translating Japanese and Korean, so they have ended up targeting more Japanese and Koreans to work jobs in Thailand, but actually, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos.
It's like every single sentence in this panel that shocks me even more. I don't know about the rest of you. Shibani, you told me something, again, that was quite shocking, that in China, if you're going to travel to some of these countries, you have to sign a waiver. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. China has been on this like really, strong educational kind of push, right? I mean, it happened first with sort of pop culture, No More Bets, right? Which is the movie that, was pretty obviously set in Cambodia, but it wasn't named as such, but, looked at a person who got duped into a scam center, and, it was the highest grossing movie in China that year. I think there's a huge amount of awareness now within China of what this industry is, and I think it also makes it very complex because I think once a country like China decides, okay, we're going to do a huge educational campaign and we're not going to they also think that if you step out of the country into somewhere like Cambodia or Myanmar, it's sort of on you. And, the whole victim identification thing, which Jake is intimately familiar with, is very imperfect, right? And, even if you are underage, even if you got tricked into this industry, if you're a Chinese citizen, oftentimes the state will see you as complicit because they've done all this awareness now, and you chose to go anyway, right? And I think that has made the job of rescue is very, very difficult because there really is very little victim identification and processes at any step of this way to mitigate, right, the harm done, and also try to reintegrate these people back into society once they go back to China. So they end up going back and then being sort of cut out from their social circles, being tainted with this industry. And what do? They go back and they continue it again, right?
So it's this self-propelling cycle. I want to get into how much money these criminal syndicates are making. Before we get there, though, Jake, I just wanted to pick up on what Shibani was saying with a quick word on, because I want to understand the global sort of expansion of this industry. And you were telling me that, in some African countries, here in China, there's a waiver that you sign, but some African countries have had to clamp down on those that might be targeted there as well.
Yeah, and also to piggyback up on what Shibani was saying, the mode of Chinese law enforcement has been such that it is seeking specifically the protection of their citizens, and what that has done 2, 3, 4 years ago, most of the nationalities being trafficked and most of the people being scammed were Chinese, and that's not the case anymore. There's still a large demographic of Chinese victims on both sides of the spectrum, but the Chinese law enforcement has mostly undercut the industry. So they've taken out the for lack of a better term, the sweatshop workers, the forced criminals, and sent them back to China, but they've left the local elites and the sophisticated criminals in place. And the death penalty that Shibani's raising is a great case for this. You learn very quickly as a very smart, well-protected criminal, you stop targeting Chinese. Not that this is some like grand conspiracy, but the nature of this has been that Chinese nationals, as a proportion of the whole, are being targeted less, and predominantly English-speaking nationals are being targeted more and more, though there's also Japanese, Korean, many other nationalities as well. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, some of the very most vulnerable people are East and West African countries. So you could say like Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia. And you take Uganda's case in particular, where you have an ambassador and 3 or 4 staff that are cross-endorsed across the entire Mekong sub-region. They have very little cachet with the governments where the people are being held, and they have very little budget to actually get people out. But their people are now being trafficked in mass. And so today, I mean, as of about 6 months ago, several of these East African countries, Uganda, sort of the leader in this, has imposed a set of extended, very, very strict vetting. If you come and say, I have a job in Thailand or Malaysia or somewhere else in the region, unless you have a really good case and it's a well-known company and your documentation is perfect, they're just sending you right back home. The reason that these countries have been targeted, we're not as compliant or trusting of our government, and nor do we have a good scam center. There's a lot of sort of deficiencies on the U.S. side, but this is not a regionally based problem. Yes. Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out a week ago and said 10 billion in the last 12 months for Americans, and that number, it admittedly, even in the documentation, is a gross understatement. And so as the number of nationalities expand, the harms are extending across the rest of the world. And people are scrambling for how to do it and how to prevent and sort of, again, blunt the growth curve on this.
Rafael.
Yeah, just to add on to what Jake was just saying, I think that what you're referring to in terms of what Secretary Rubio put out was the OFAC sanctions that were put out by the Treasury Department. That targeted a number of these criminal scam syndicates across mostly Cambodia and Myanmar, but also a little bit in Laos and Philippines. And I think that was a really important step by the U.S. government, especially because these are Treasury sanctions. They really have bite. Those kinds of financial sanctions, the same kind of sanctions that are used to target, North Korean, banks and Iranian, missile production and those kinds of things. So they really can have some effect, and I think we'll hope to see some of that really start to put a dent in it. I think it's also going to be interesting to see what happens at the ASEAN summit that's coming up in Kuala Lumpur this month, because I think you're right. Secretary Rubio has really put some oomph into this from the United States perspective, and I think that we really hope that what we see at this summit is a recognition and a mustering of political will, collective political will to go after these scam centers, which is just so badly needed right now. And so I think that we are starting to see more of that, and that is an encouraging thing to see.
David, I know you want to pick up, and
Yeah,
Shibani will come to you in a second.
Could
Go
I
ahead.
just pick up on what Rafael was saying? That I think we also need to see the dimension of the scam centers as it's a huge business. It's a huge transnational business, and consequently, we do need to deal with the money flows.
How much are they making?
I think the estimate is that it's in the billions of dollars. It's some estimates are scam centers. If they were a country, they'll be the 3rd largest economy in the world after the US and China. right? If just scams were a business by itself, that's the shocking state. But the point I want to make is that because it's such a huge economy, it's all linked, it's a business. Actually, we do need to deal with the money flows. So the Treasury sanctions, I think, might be the direction to take. But one of the elements we should look at is also ultimately they have to get the money out into fiat.
Yep.
So they use cryptocurrencies, they partly to obfuscate, partly to move it quickly, but ultimately it has to come out in fiat. So the jurisdictions where they do transact it back into fiat are the places where we should also apply pressure. It's just that good old-fashioned, know your customer, understand who's coming out with it. In some cases, they're actually using ATM machines to withdraw the money. So good old-fashioned law enforcement can come down. One particular example is that in Singapore, we've noticed that we have money mules. So people sell their credentials to set up bank accounts, and then these are used by the scam syndicates to move that money quickly across accounts and out of Singapore. We've changed the law so that it's become an offense to sell your credentials and create these bank accounts, and we're taking action. I think the police are now currently investigating 500 individuals in Singapore who have sold these their credentials. And further, once you've been convicted, then I think the actions will be that it will limit the number of accounts that you as an individual can open. So I think hopefully by squeezing some of these elements on the financial sides, we will also reduce the scale of the industry.
We need to see this happen uniformly in other places as well. It's great that it's happening in Singapore, but you want to see that model replicated in other countries. Shibani, I know that you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, not to be the cynical journalist on the panel,
No,
but
please be the cynical journalist. It's okay.
journalist on the panel, on the sort of like government piece of this and the, you know, on ASEAN and APEC and stuff. I think for me, like two things. One, sanctions, sure, but, you know, I think that the US has also dealt a huge blow by what's happened with USAID. I mean, USAID was funding a vast majority of the programs that was helping on the ground free victims, right? And those people are now, you know, sitting around with all the networks to be able to do it, but none of the funding, right? And in that gap, right, people who need to be rescued have turned essentially to criminals again to try to get them out, and that is something that has happened in the past few months because of the political climate in Washington and because of what's happening in Washington today. So I think, you know, while there has been, you know, quite some good moves on sanctions and stuff, there's a total other side of this that honestly criminals are watching what's happening in Washington and thinking it's open season for criminality, and there's a lot of impunity for them to operate. And secondly, I think it's very, very hard to combat this issue unless other ASEAN countries are sort of willing to fully call out Cambodia for their state-led role in this. I know I just said the US has some failings, but you know, the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report that came out that I'm sure Jake would want to speak to as well, literally called out the Cambodian government as being a state sponsor of trafficking. If other countries in the region cannot do that and back that up, then we cannot make any real moves toward it, right? And it's very,
Jake.
very low, so.
Yeah, just to emphasize this point a little bit further, it's really hard to overstate how bad the counter-trafficking response situation is in these countries, and both due to the repression coming from the Cambodian government, which is profound and egregious and really difficult to ignore, but also because the people who were helping victims get out of compounds, who are caring for them, helping them get back to their country, actually mapping out where the compounds are and who's involved. And then also, very notably, a lot of the 12 million ads that Meta has rightfully taken down came from their trusted partners who were being funded largely by the US government to learn about this issue. And you know, we're working in lockstep with Meta. And so if you're seeing a reduction in the number of reported ads, it very well could be because those organizations are out of funding and out of resources to continue investing in that. Could be one driving factor. Another really important point here that Shibani mentioned is, as we move towards collaboration, we can't lose sight of who the most criminally culpable perpetrators are. And this great U.S. Treasury action did not mention a single state-embedded actor. is a really, really notable gap here. And we also have made almost no progress on the most significant opportunity to financially constrain the countries that are, as you said, like converting to fiat currency. So the Financial Advisory Task Force is one of the last remaining really, really strong multilateral mechanisms to constrain financial systems that have such profound strategic vulnerabilities that they become sort of problematic to the rest of the world. And neither Cambodia nor Laos are treated as a part of that list. And there's lots of reasons for that. It's a broken process that needs resolution, but there needs to, as we move through this process and start figuring out how to collaborate well, we need to stay focused on not becoming so sanitized in the way that we talk about it that we lose track of the fact that these things exist because they're entire jurisdictions and sovereign territories that not only have allowed a permissive environment, but are actually co-perpetrating alongside the criminals.
Can I just want to state one thing about the accounts I referenced. Okay, what I said, and I'll just repeat this. Since 2024, since last year, we've taken down over 12 million accounts specifically coming from those scam centers. These are not ads that might have been put on our platform by partners of ours. In fact, we still do a lot of the work with our partners in civil society, anti-trafficking groups, the International Justice Mission. We do things like we run search interstitials. So if someone does try to look for a job, we will cut those searches off if they try to go to certain places that would lead them to scam centers. We do things like if there are people that are placing job ads that are too good to be true, we will disallow those ads, right? So those are the kinds of things that we are doing.
Okay,
sorry, can I?
Well, I'm also very conscious of the time, very conscious of the time, but I do. It would be great if you would all talk to one another more after this, particularly because there's great work that you can all do together. Because then we mentioned this, the collaboration is really important. Jake, I'm very sorry to cut you off. No. I promised that we would end on some hope. We must do that. I think my last question is really around, we may all in this room feel protected because we're here in Singapore, and we might think that our lives are disconnected from stories like this. What can we do as individuals? What role can we play to just do something positive where this story is concerned? And I know it seems really disconnected, but what could it be? Could it be me saying, well, I went to this panel and we talked about this, and sharing the information with others so they don't get duped? What would it be? What would you think of?
I think information sharing is really important. We do a lot of public service campaigns and advocacy to educate the public about how to recognize a scam versus a legitimate, contact. I think those are a big part of it, and I just would come back also to the collaboration. I think we have done a lot better in 2025 than we ever did before, working collectively as industry, government, and civil society. And there is a lot of momentum, as much as this problem is very acute, especially in this part of the world. I would say that if I compare the conversation we're having today versus the conversation we'd have on this issue a year ago, it's a much better, more sophisticated conversation where we can already say, hey, look, this is still a huge problem, but we've made a significant amount of progress.
That's good news. Shibani?
I think information and just like education is really key to all of this. And also just like really being aware of your surroundings. And actually kind of borrowing this from the Unheard crew, but when they went to Cambodia, there was like a group of Bangladeshi or Pakistani guys who were all together and seemed really like green and fresh and seemed a little bit like excited about this like new job that they were coming for. My husband had the same experience recently when he traveled to Laos. He saw a group of Indians who had like never left the country before coming to a new job. If you see things like that, just like try to take note, maybe give them your number or something, because they might be ending up in a really bad situation and may not know how to get out of it or contact the outside world. So yeah, I think awareness and just like when you travel, when you're in the airport, when you're in countries in the region, just like kind of look around you,
Look out
and
for people.
you see things that seem off. It probably is a little off.
And read Shibani's stories as well. David.
Yeah, I think public education is key. My take on it is that all of us have instincts with respect to the physical world. You know, we don't have to know when it's less safe, etc. We didn't attend some course by the police and because we got educated as we were growing up. But unfortunately, we don't have these same instincts in the digital world. So we're actually not digital natives. I speak the language, but with an accent. I hope that the next generation will have these instincts. So the first thing I'd say is that all of us need a little bit of digital skepticism. It's not just education. I think we need to have digital skepticism. Don't believe everything that you see online or everything that you hear. Second thing I'll say is that we also need to support a rebalance. You've heard all these stories. I think I'll make the case that we need to rebalance a little bit towards security, away from convenience, privacy, etc. We want our cake and eat it too, I understand. But the reality today is that we've pushed a lot on convenience, instant gratification, privacy, etc. But it comes at a cost. And the cost is not just being paid by us. It's being paid by these hundreds, thousands of people, some of whom are facing dire situations. So I think that as citizens, we also need to support this rebalance.
You get the last word, Jake.
Sure. So you're asking for hope. We're confronted by a lot of situations where state actors are doing bad things, corporations are trying to figure out how to align their incentives with the common good, etc. This one, you have some of the most vulnerable and exploited people in the world who have an immediate direct connection to people with real power. And so the power in just like drawing this thread together, the power of storytelling is absolutely prime here. And to like go back to your beginning point, Escaping Scam City podcast, of all of the projects I've gotten to be involved in over the last 4 years on this issue, absolute most fulfilling, and I would say one of the most impactful, because we got to tell the story of these people who are not just victims. These are two people who fell in love and helped each other escape, and it's a story of people from all over the world who got to be involved in that story. And it's not until I think the world gains a sort of greater understanding of the common humanity and the common challenges that they're having with people who are enduring these horrific things, and how our complicity or irritation with this issue is actually going to determine what happens to those people. That's when we're going to start to see real collaboration and real progress towards resolving this.
So Escaping Scam City, I believe you can listen to it wherever you get your podcasts, right? I'm getting nods of approval there. Do listen to it. You'll find it moving, very informative. And like you say, this is an incredible way to tell a very difficult story. Thank you for bringing it to the fore, all of you, Rafael, Shibani, David, Jake. Please show your appreciation for our panel.